The number one chess game of the 1960s is Mikhail Botvinnik versus Mikhail Tal, Game 6 of their 1960 World Chess Championship match. Today we know Tal as an incredibly talented and creative attacking player, but we also know that he had health problems and was only world champion for 1 year. I think it's worthwhile to think back to the 1960s when he became the youngest world chess champion for decades and imagine that to the players at that time, it seemed like he might be the decade-long dominant champion that Kasparov and Carlsen would become. Now, in this game, he plays what is, in my opinion, the ballsiest chess move of all time when in the highest stage in chess against the toughest competition in chess, he makes an entirely intuitive piece sacrifice. Botvinnik opens the game here with 1c4, his trusty and flexible favorite first opening move. Of course, he was famous for playing the English opening and infusing the opening with many excellent and rich ideas. Now, Tal in this game is going to select the King's Indian defense, and we'll see more comments from him in a moment about that selection. Botvinnik goes for this bishop g2 fianchettoed setup, and ultimately here on move 7, we do see Tal strike out with pawn to e5, and he says about this move, the King's Indian defense with 2c5 and the Nimzo Indian defense had, in general, not produced the desired effect. There was still one other double-edged opening, the classical King's Indian defense. This is what we chose. One of the things that had helped shape our decision was that Botvinnik against the King's Indian defense usually selected an old-fashioned continuation connected with the fianchettoing of the king's bishop, which, in my opinion, does not give white an opening advantage. With both players committed to their selected openings, Tal to the King's Indian defense with the e5 pawn push and Botvinnik to the fianchettoed King's Indian setup for white, we now see the game develop with e4, c6, pawn to h3, a move designed to stop knight g4 after bishop to e3, and now queen to b6 from Tal. This move intends to capture on d4, and after knight capture, there is the tactic knight takes e4, so some resolution is needed in the middle of the board. This queen b6 setup is common here in the early days of the King's Indian defense, and Tal does cite games by Bronstein against Zita and against Pachman with some great tactics that show some of the benefits of the King's Indian defense. So here, after queen b6, we see pawn d5, locking in the central structure and establishing the spatial advantage for white, and then pawn takes, knight c5, and knight e1, an interesting move that is designed to go for knight d3 and trade off the knight on c5. Now bishop to d7, knight d3 after 10 minutes of thought, which Tal criticizes, saying, this is the clear intention to follow up. It's definitely the best move. Why are you spending 10 minutes on this move? Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, rook f to c8, swinging over for activity on the c-file. And now rook b1, and in this position, we do see the move knight h5, a bit of a committal move, sidelining the knight and getting ready for pawn to f5. Now, on an objective level, when you look at this with computer analysis, which of course is something that I think Tal would really rail against, he would take offense that you're breaking this game down, this beautiful game down with computer analysis. But on an objective level, this does seem to lead to a good advantage for white if he plays very carefully, very accurately. Therefore, perhaps better was a move like queen d4, which is interesting. White is probably a little bit better, but it's manageable, and there are some other ideas you could try as well. But in this game, we are definitely going to see committal moves from Tal the whole way through, and we do see knight h5 here. Now, bishop to e3 attacking the queen slides up to b4, the queen goes to e2 for white, pointing at the knight on h5 and also defending b2. This attack on the knight on h5 does make it harder to achieve pawn to f5 because after a capture, you cannot recapture with the pawn without hanging your knight. Now, in this position, Tal does need to decide whether or not to go for a committal advance with pawn to f5, and he comments, the variation 17 f5 e takes f5, bishop takes f5, rook b to c1, conceding the square e4 would be positionally unjustified. Black decides to carry out f5 with greater effect, and now the sacrifice of the knight on f4 becomes less hazy. The move that Tal plays to prepare pawn to f5 and ultimately knight to f4 with greater effect is rook c4, preparing to double rooks on the c file and also creating some unfortunate pressure for white along the fourth rank. Now, after this move, we see rook f to c1 from Botvinnik, and Tal again comments, white wants to smoke out black's pieces with bishop f1 and then satisfactorily carry out a massive exchanges. The ending will be extremely favorable for him because of the fact that black's knight and king's bishop are stuck on the king side and will not be able to switch over to defense quickly. Tal continues piling up on the c file and brings his other rook over. Now, after rook ac8, we see the waiting move king h2, and Tal now feels it is right to strike out with pawn to f5. There is the capture on f5, and now bishop takes f5, attacking the rook here on b1. It moves over, rook to a1. Tal comments, Botvinnik probably thought that now black's pieces, because of the threat of 22g4, were forced to retreat and white would be able to occupy e4 at his own convenience. But there is a surprise waiting for him. In this position, if Tal submits to Botvinnik's threat of g4 and retreats here with knight f6, then there can be g4, bishop d7, and queen d2. This is clearly positionally better for Botvinnik. He has more freedom for his pieces, he has more space in the position, and he will eventually challenge the control of the c file and establish a strong positional advantage. I think that one thing to appreciate is how much Tal is in tune to this attempt by Botvinnik to establish a clear positional advantage and to restrict any attempts to get counterplay for Tal. I think this goes against Tal's reputation as an attacker with no real positional sense. Of course, that's not true. He was also a great positional player, otherwise he could not be so deeply appreciative of what Botvinnik was up to. Now, to avoid this, he doesn't want to get restricted. He plays one of the most radical, one of the ballsiest moves in chess history in this position on move 21. That is knight to f4. There is simply no other way to go forward in this position. All of Tal's other pieces are on excellent squares, occupying good diagonals, good ranks, good files. Only this bishop, which is freed by the knight's sacrifice, doesn't have particularly strong scope, and Tal is willing to give up the knight to fully free his pieces and to avoid retreating. About this move, he says, in my opinion, the arguments that this move raised were completely pointless. Suffice it to say that all the other continuations are bad, and if the knight sacrifice is incorrect, then a question mark should not be placed after black's 21st move, but, say, after his 17th. Be that as it may. After the knight sacrifice, black's pieces, especially the recently unemployed bishop on g7, become very active all over the board, and white has to seriously take into account all the numerous sharp variations. The sacrifice must be accepted. Botvinnik does accept Tal's incredible knight sacrifice. Pawn takes f4 and pawn takes f4. Now, Botvinnik's bishop here on e3 is under attack, and meanwhile, Tal's bishop on g7 is freed and is a monster at this point. Now, a tempting move here is bishop takes a7, moving the attacked bishop and picking off a pawn. However, after bishop takes a7, there is the move queen to a5, trapping the bishop, and Tal secures an advantage. However, an important wrinkle exists, and it is pointed out by Tal in his incredible and deep notes to the game and by other analysts. It is the move 23a3, leaving the bishop hanging for a moment to make this intermediate move that attacks the queen here on b4. After the queen is attacked on b4, the natural move is to slide into b3 here. And you might ask, why would you want to play a3 giving up the square on b3? It seems very anti-positional. How can it help you out? Well, the answer is now you can play bishop takes a7 because there is no longer a queen a5 move that will trap the bishop. And really, this is a winning position, though it remains very, very murky. After bishop takes a7, the critical line here is bishop to e5, threatening pawn to f3, and there are multiple responses, including moving the queen and physically blocking the pawn, but the only winning path is pawn to f3, which does lock in this bishop here, but it prepares additional retreat squares for the bishop on a7. And now after b6 trying to trap that bishop, there is pawn to a4. This a4 move is a computer move. Absolute credit to Stockfish 12 here. This move does seem to be missed by analysts at the time, and it is only this move that seems to give white a winning advantage. There are now ideas, particularly of pawn to a5, freeing the queen side for white, and also moves like rook a3 here. This position does seem to be winning for Botvinnik. But again, that is only one continuation that is possible. There are many false paths, and you must play perfectly like a computer to make it down this path. Now, in the game, after pawn takes f4, Botvinnik instead just retreated the bishop with bishop back to d2. And now, in this position, Tal comments about the possible best continuation. I rejected the continuation in view of the variation after bishop e5, f3, queen takes b2, knight to d1, exclamation point, queen to d4, rook takes c4, rook takes c4, rook c1, rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes d5, and bishop f1, and black's 3 pawns do not outweigh white's extra piece. Now, Tal is correct that this continuation is undesirable. There are some other possible improvements that the computer points out, but still, this continuation or one other continuation, some of the other continuations that exist after bishop e5 do seem to be better, and Tal in his notes is pointing out that bishop e5 is the better move. He also says that the fact that he didn't play the best move in this position just supports the fact that his whole sacrifice of the knight is an intuitive sacrifice that is not perfectly calculated and instead is based on his sense of the dynamics of the position. So instead of bishop e5, he plays the move queen takes b2, nabbing this pawn here on b2, and Botvinnik plays rook a to b1, and then Tal strikes out with the move pawn to f3. Tal says black had placed all of his hopes on this move. After Tal's incredible move pawn to f3, everything is hanging in this position. This bishop, this queen, there is huge pressure on the c-file, the rook on b1 is hanging, and of course, we cannot forget that the intermediate move pawn to f3 has left Tal's own queen hanging on b2. Botvinnik is faced with a very, very hard decision. The correct move, it turns out, would have been bishop takes f3, and Tal comments, Botvinnik thought that the capture on f3 was advantageous for black, and preferred the immediate exchange of queens, the continuation we'll see in the game. But in his calculations, white underestimated the strength of black's 26th move. Now, in this position, play can continue. Bishop takes b1, rook takes b1, attacking here the queen on b2 again. The queen can go to c2, and there are 2 winning moves here. Rook c1, or Salo Floor's incredible move, bishop to e4, the nicest winning move in this position. Now, after rook takes e4, when there is knight takes e4, there is queen takes b1, and Tal is actually winning material, but for once in this game, it is Botvinnik who gets to go on the attack, and he can now play knight takes d6, intending queen to e6 check with devastation and a very likely smothered mate. So the rook must go to f8 to prepare to sacrifice itself after knight f7, because if you don't, of course, smothered mate here, queen to g8, always, always pretty, and knight f7 checkmate. And after rook takes f7, queen takes f7, in this complicated position, Botvinnik is much, much better. So backing up here, instead of bishop takes f3, Botvinnik caves to the tension in the position and plays rook takes b2, allowing an exchange of queens where he is up a piece for the moment, but it turns out that Tal's pressure is too strong. And now we get pawn takes on e2 and rook to b3. Rook d4, the move that Botvinnik had missed. This move is too strong, and now Tal is winning in this position. There is bishop to e1, bishop to e5 check, king g1, and now Tal does play a winning move, but he also points out that Unfortunately, Black missed a possibility to end the game quickly and beautifully by rook takes c3, rook takes c3, rook d1. This rook is under attack. There's obviously huge pressure here along the back rank, and this pawn is enormous. Even though Tal is down a rook in this position, he is winning. If the rook moves from c3 where it is under attack, there is bishop to b2, and there is nothing to do about all of the pressure here on the first rank. Of course, the trades simply allow this pawn to promote, and if you lose this bishop here on e1, then also you're going to be able to move the rook back out of the way and promote this pawn. It's just totally decisive for Tal. However, the fact that Tal does not find this, while a bit of a disappointment to him and potentially to us, does not change the fact that after bishop f4, Tal is also winning in this game continuation. In fact, the rest of the game, after the simplifications, after knight takes e2, rook takes on c1, knight takes on d4, rook takes on e1 with check, bishop f1, and bishop e4, is really a foregone conclusion. In this position, Tal has the better pawn structure, the bishop pair, and an extra pawn. Although it does take another 16 moves from here to win the game, there's never any doubt that Tal is going to win. It's just struggling for Botvinnik. He shouldn't resign yet, but he's not going to be able to save the game. The king approaches for Tal. The d pawn gets rolling up the board. Now, Tal is willing to give up his bishop pair advantage in simplification here, but he gains in return this huge pass c pawn, and there's no way to stop it. The game finished king d5, rook a7, pawn c3, rook c7, king d4, and rook d7 check was actually the sealed move, not played over the board, but Botvinnik did resign without resuming this adjourned game because the c-pawn will promote in short order. I hope that you've enjoyed this game and all of the games we've looked at in this Best of the 60s series. If you want to catch some of the other games that you might have missed, then simply click on the Best of the 60s playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.